Hi, my name's James from Binary Plus Training, and this is Your First Aid Kit, your weekly look into the world of first aid, how it can affect you, your family, your friends, and everybody else you come into contact with. This week, episode 4, we're looking at first aid kits. So first aid kits, what is the fuss all about, and what exactly do you need to have in your place of work to make sure that you've got the right level of first aid kits so you can provide the right level of cover and protection to the people who are in your workplace? Well, prior to 2015, the Health and Safety Executive used to have their 3 HSE first aid kits, they're small, medium and large, as well as a list of exactly what you were supposed to have in your first aid kit. But from 2015 onwards, they changed the guidelines slightly, and they no longer list exactly what sort of items or equipment you should have in your first aid kit. Instead, they now list a guide as to suggested items that should appear in your first aid kit. So moving on from that, the recommendation ideally now is that your first aid kits comply with British standards, specifically British Standard 8599-1:2019, which is the most up-to-date British standard for first aid kits. They set out the minimum recommended content for your first aid kits in your workplace, and generally speaking, most of the British Standard compliant first aid kits fit into your 3 categories, and they are simply small, medium and large. But when do you need which size? It's a little bit more complicated than that. There is some guidance available as to which first aid kit is correct or the best size for which workplace. Now, we're going to separate it into 2 different things. We're going to separate it into low hazard workplaces, such as shops, offices, libraries, places like that. And then your high hazard environments, such as light engineering, assembly work, food processing, warehouses, places using dangerous machinery, sharp objects, construction, chemicals, etc. So your higher hazard workplaces. But we're going to look at the low hazard workplaces first. So most low hazard workplaces only need a smaller level of provision when it comes to first aid kits. So for less than around 25 employees, 1 small first aid kit is recommended. And like I say, ideally one that complies to the British standards. For 25 to 100 employees, it's recommended that you have 1 medium first aid kit. And for more than 100 employees, it's recommended you have 1 large kit for every 100 employees, or part thereof. So if you've got 200 employees, 2 large first aid kits. If you've got 230 employees, then you're better off moving up to 3 large first aid kits at that point. High hazard workplaces, on the other hand, they come in at a different level. So for up to 5 people, it's recommended you have the small kit. For up to 25 people, so 5 to 25, then you go to your medium kit. Or for more than 25 employees, you're recommended to have 1 large kit for every 25 employees. Now, there are some differences between the old HSE kits and the British Standard kits. The main differences being there are more disposable gloves in the British Standard kits, and these have to be nitrile gloves, not latex gloves, because there are quite a few people who have latex allergies, so we make sure that they are nitrile gloves to reduce that risk. And also, they don't add as many of the triangular bandages into the into the British Standard kits as they used to be in the HSE kits, because we don't really use triangular bandages at a first aid at work level to immobilise injured limbs anymore. There are better ways of dealing with that. We have smaller absorbent wound dressings for injuries to fingers, water-based sterile burn gel dressings, which are really good for the transport to hospital. They can work really well. The British Standard first aid kits have shears in them, cloth cutting scissors. They're like scissors. They're slightly different. The British Standard first aid kits contain a resuscitation face shield, because we really shouldn't be blowing into anybody without thinking about protecting ourselves. The British Standard requirements are that there is also a heat-reflecting foil survival blanket in there, as well as sterile saline wipes, so that we use those to clean wounds and things. Please don't use the alcohol wipes, because on broken skin, my goodness, will they know that you've used alcohol wipes if that's the case. All first aid kits must also have a guidance leaflet in them, just in case you're running on an appointed person rather than a qualified first aider, so that they can have a look at the book and figure out what it is that they're supposed to be doing, although they are no replacement for a decent first aid course to make sure that you are well trained on what you are doing. If you work in a catering environment, you need to make sure that your first aid kits are the catering versions. There's not really any difference to the contents of them, other than the fact that all your dressings and everything are blue. Now, why would you need blue plasters and why would you need blue bandages? Well, it's very, very simple, in that we eat a lot of food that is pretty much skin-coloured. If you think about cooked chicken, for example, and if you had chicken and mayonnaise or a coronation chicken butty for your dinner, and the person who was preparing it was wearing a skin-coloured plaster, if that plaster was to fall off and land in the food, you might not notice it very easily, whereas the blue ones, they stick out really quite well. We don't really eat very much bright blue food, so our catering first aid kits should have blue dressings and things like that in it. We've also got other first aid kits for if you're working with children. We have childcare based first aid kits. There isn't a British standard for those, but they are designed for performing first aid on the children. So basically everything's that little bit smaller. And it's not a bad idea to have things like cold compresses and things like that in your children's first aid kits. And moving on as well, there is a British standard for outdoor vehicle, that's the word, for vehicle first aid kits, which have slightly different requirements. Things like making sure that you've got eye wash and things like that in there, because in your vehicle first aid kit, you don't have easy, ready access to fresh running water. Well, it's assumed that you don't if you're out in your car, unlike when you are in the office. So when you do your risk assessment, because everything involves a good risk assessment, do make sure that you think about your vehicles as well. If you have vehicles as part of your business, they should also have first aid kits in there as well. And it is possible, if you have a catering-based, vehicle-based business, that you can get a vehicle-based first aid kit that is also blue, to make sure that if you're working as a mobile food delivery person or something like that, and you're preparing any food or drinks from the vehicle, that you can make sure that you meet both of those requirements by having it comply with the British standards for travelling out and about, as well as the requirements for a catering first aid kit. So there's your very brief overview. First aid kits are readily available from lots of places. We sell them ourselves. You can get them from Amazon. There are many, many, many different suppliers. Do try and make sure that your first aid kits comply with the British standards. It's British Standard 8599-1 for workplace first aid kits, and -2 for your vehicular first aid kits. So please make sure your first aid kits are nice and compliant. And remember, there are things that you should not be keeping in your first aid kits. You cannot keep any form of medication in your first aid kit. That's really important, that we don't allow the two things to be confused. Your first aid kit it's literally what it says on the tin. It is for first aid only. It's not a medicine box like we used to. I don't know. My grandma used to keep it in a box in her kitchen. I'm sure everybody has one at home, but for work, we're not allowed to keep things like that. So remember, no medication at all in our first aid kits. No creams, no ointments, nothing like that. There is a slight exception if you are a school, in that you can keep things with your first aid kit. Schools are allowed to keep things like asthma inhalers and adrenaline auto-injectors but they are very separate restrictions, and they are only for schools. Generally speaking, workplaces, first aid kits, that's all you're allowed to keep in there. So join me very soon. We're going to be having our top tip very shortly, so I will see you in a moment. So today's top tip, we're going to be looking at dressing minor injuries. So how do we dress a minor injury? Well, we used to do elevation of wounds and things like that. It used to be a little bit more complicated than it is now. We've simplified things. So there are a few steps that we need to follow. The first thing we need to do, if somebody comes to us in our workplace or in our home with, let's say they've got a cut on the back of their hand, the first thing we need to do is we need to examine it. We need to have a look at it. You can't treat it, you can't dress it unless you've had a look at it. The reason being, you want to see whether there's any embedded objects in there, you want to see whether there's any dirt in there, you need to see how big it is. If you have a look at the back of somebody's hand and they've got a cut 0.5 centimetre long, that's going to need a very different size dressing to if they've got a 4-inch long gash on the back of their hand. So you need to have a look at it, you need to examine it. You may need to clean it, depends on what it looks like. As long as there is no embedded object in there, then give it a good clean, make sure it's all nice and clean, and then we need to apply some pressure. Now, I would suggest you apply pressure with the dressing that you're going to apply onto the wound. A little bit of a tip, put a wet wound needs a wet dressing. A dry wound needs a dry dressing. The reason being that it's just going to reduce the chances of it sticking. So get your sterile saline if you've got it, otherwise Maine's tap water. A little bit of it on the dressing. If it's going on a wet wound, apply your dressing. It's slightly damp, just reduces the chances of it sticking. So when we're applying the pressure, apply the pressure with the dressing that you're going to apply to the wound. After about 10 minutes, we can have a bit of a look, make sure it's stopped bleeding. We're not going to take the dressing off because the first scab that will have formed on that dressing is the best one. And the first clot's the best clot, we say. So we're going to leave that there, but we're just going to make sure it stops bleeding. And if after 10 minutes it has stopped bleeding, then we can just dress it and they can go about their business as before. If after 10 minutes it hasn't stopped bleeding, we're going to apply that pressure again for another 10 minutes and check whether it's stopped bleeding. If it's not stopped bleeding after 20-30 minutes, we're going to be considering at this point that we might need to get some more specialist attention. So we might need to pop them to urgent care or the minor injuries unit, whatever you've got in your vicinity, depending on NHS provision in your area. So that's today's top tip, is to examine, clean, press and dress. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us on your first aid kit today. I hope you have found it informative and useful. Make sure you join us next Thursday when we're going to be looking into possible impact of the insurance industry and your insurance documentation on the first aid provision in your workplace. So make sure you join us next Thursday. Thank you ever so much for listening this week. Please make sure that you hit whatever button it is on whatever device you're using in order to subscribe so that you get notified when the next episode of your first aid kit comes out. And I will speak to you all next week. Have a very good week.